Hey, welcome to the Joe Wild Morning Poem Show, and continuing with my class on 380, my 380 class, Literary Movements and Betrayals. We're going to do one of the opening classes here today on the show, which is we're going to deal with Wordsworth and Coleridge. Now, Wordsworth and Coleridge collaborated, or very fruitfully failed to collaborate, in a sense, in the lyrical ballads. Their chief aesthetic difference was this. Wordsworth believed that poetry was the language of the common man. Of course, he copied these chord changes from Rousseau, the idea of the noble savage, the idea of an atavistic wisdom that superseded either the wisdom of thinking or, for that matter, feeling. We often think of Wordsworth as the feeling poet, but in a sense, his whole idea of strong emotions recollected in tranquility is about not going towards the poem through the emotions, but through the intuitions that succeed or follow, or the sense impressions, the dream that follows the emotional experience. And it was this love of the irrational, in a sense, of the atavistic, of that which did not follow Newtonian time, that spurred on Romanticism to a great extent. And it's around this time that we get great ghost stories. And we'll talk about that. But the main thing to remember is the main aesthetic difference between Wordsworth was one of language, and Coleridge was one of language. Wordsworth believed that the poem should be written in a speech the common man would understand. And Coleridge thought this was too much of a reduction. And he put the emphasis on universality. He still believed in the universal worth of poetry, but he put it on imagination, as William Blake had. Very different takes on imagination, but imagination nonetheless. And, well, let's think about it. We'll think of what here's a quote from Coleridge's great work, Biographia Literaria, Latin for literary biography. Some of the best Shakespeare criticism ever in this, but let's read the quote. The primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite of the eternal act of creation, of the infinite I am. So Coleridge immediately ties in his idea of poetry with a God term, with the highest term. The secondary I consider as an echo of the former, coexisting with the conscious will, yet still identical with the primary in the kind of its agency, and differing only in degree and in the mode of its operation. Right? The imagination involved in the poetry, and poetry is what produces a higher quality of verse. The primary imagination is a spontaneous creation of new ideas. Again, intuition. Not much different than what the surrealists believed. Best thought this idea of getting it out there, creation of new ideas, and it's spontaneous. All right? The secondary imagination is mitigated by the conscious act of imagination. Therefore, it is hindered by not only imperfect creation, but also by imperfect expression. To further subdivide the act of imagination, Coleridge introduces his concept of fancy. All right, fancy is different than imagination. Fancy is the lowest form of imagination because it has no other counters to play with but fixities and definites. With fancy, there is no creation involved. It is simply a reconfiguration of existing ideas. Rather than composing a completely original concept or description, the fanciful poet simply reorders concepts. That would be like a poet who endlessly plays with the trope of carpe diem, for instance, seize the day, putting them in a new and possibly fresh relationship to each other. That's about the best that poet can hope for. That's what a minor poet is. Coleridge also writes that poetry reveals itself in the balance of, or reconciliation of opposite or discordant qualities. Burke stole this a little bit from him when he talked about perspectives by incongruity. The idea of putting two unlike things together. Through juxtaposition, ideas, concepts, and descriptions are made clear. So contrast, dissonance. All right? The more imaginative the juxtaposition is, the more exciting the poem becomes. As with Wordsworth, Coleridge also combines his theoretical ideas in his poetry. He abandons Wordsworth's notion of poetry for the common man, and he uses lofty language, poetic diction, and subject matter that is specialized. All right. While he still holds a reverence for nature inherent to romantic literature, his poems are not exclusively based around the natural. Here he's similar to William Blake. William Blake's emphasis on the imagination skewed the idea of holding the mirror up to nature. He makes use of primary imagination in his work because it is the kind of imagination he values most, and avoids secondary imagination or fancy as much as possible. So he's trying to get at this imagination that's intuitive, instinctive, again, the irrational. Wordsworth, when he takes his trip through the Swiss Alps, gets knocked off his horse and knocked senseless, and feels that this is the true realm of the poetic, this place where you're knocked senseless. So poetry then takes on the quality of stupor or stupidity, or, another way, in a trance. You are receiving it. So Wordsworth was not without his mystical angle either, for all his love of common speech. But let's think about this. We'll look at the poems. The poem is the manifestation of drug-induced vision. So you got these two lines, although they begin together, of Coleridge and Wordsworth. And we're still following them to a great extent. The idea of should poems be written so that the so-called common man can relate to them? And what is a common man? Or should they be written in such a way that language is as inventive as possible, damn the common man, that the imagination is allowed to let fly, that imagination is emphasized over emotion? In other words, if emotion exists in the poem at all, it'd be highly stylized. And these are the two aesthetic bags in which we can put most of modern poetry, written in the 20th century. We'll get back to that later. Right now, what can I say? Coleridge and Wordsworth, they both valued artful poetry. And they had some different theoretical opinions. But they both created these complex poems. In fact, Wordsworth's probably the dominant force of English poetry for over 200 years. He took the conversation poem, which Coleridge had invented, all right, to a certain extent, and grown bored with fairly quickly, and he took it to its highest point. And it's really the chief form of meditative free verse we write now. And what I can say about the two of them is that they conspired together. And the Romantic movement at that time, they were rebelling against the idea that reason was the chief arbiter of poetic invention. They were rebelling against the age of reason, sense and sensibility. All right, we'll get to it more later. Right now it's early in the morning and I'm feeling a little groggy, but more later.